Hello, everyone. My name is Pasqua Ruggiero, and I'm a data scientist at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. And today I will be presenting my project for the HPCC Summit Community Day for 2023. The project is called Vulnerable Victim Monitoring, Connecting the Dots to Find Missing Children Quickly. And before I start this presentation, I would like to issue a brief warning of the content of the subjects that will be discussed in this presentation. These topics will include those such as missing children's cases, child sex trafficking, and other crimes involving children. So if at any time you need to step away from your computer, please do so, as your mental health comes first. So I will give a brief overview of how the presentation will be structured today. So first, I will start off with an introduction of the affiliated programs and the data sources that were used for this project. Next, I will describe the analysis that was performed. After that, I will talk about some current initiatives that are being taken in response to the results of this project, in addition to some ideas that we have for future projects. And finally, I will state a call to action and give some options for how you can help find missing children. And if at any point during this presentation you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. You do not have to wait until the end to ask your questions. And now for the introduction, I would like to start off by showing you all an overview video of the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC for short.
When a child is born, parents and caregivers have hopes and dreams for that child. We presume they will always be there with us as we guide them through the early years, through school, and all the way through that moment when we send them out on their own. And we trust that for our lifetime, our children will always be with us, near us, and safe. But what happens when our dreams don't match reality? What happens when a child disappears? At the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we know that when a child is missing or exploited, lives are changed. We believe that every child deserves a safe childhood. Our specialized training help equip law enforcement to find missing children and protect your communities. And our education for children and families helps teach kids how to stay safe on and offline. No family should have to deal with the loss of a child. No child should have their innocence taken away. At the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we are working every day to keep your dreams for your family a reality. Hope is why we're here.
So the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC for short, was founded by John and Vervae Walsh in 1984, and it is currently the largest child protection organization. Some of its initiatives include the Cyber Tip Line, which is a method that people are able to report incidents of suspected child exploitation. And this was created in 1998, and since its creation has received millions of tips. In addition to the Cyber Tip Line, NCMEC is also responsible for the distribution of missing children's posters. These posters include personal information of the child and other identifying traits so that people are able to best identify them and report sightings of them. This information includes the name, date of birth, and the state of disappearance on these missing children posters. And in addition to these, NCMEC also provides educational resources for both victims and those that are keeping them safe. And for the ATOM program, ATOM stands for the Automated Delivery of Alerts on Missing Children. And it was a program that was launched in 2000 and was named in memory of Adam Walsh. And this program was created by LexisNexis Risk Solutions and was donated to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Basically, how this program works is that there is an algorithm that helps best distribute missing children's posters. And so people are able to sign up for email alerts on missing children. And when a child goes missing in their geographic area, their poster is distributed to people of the matching area. The poster alert includes a photo and important case details, including demographic and descriptive text of the missing child, as was explained in the previous slide. And as of right now, Adam has over 1.2 million recipients of these email alerts. And in the year 2022 alone, the Adam program was able to distribute over 1.5 million poster alerts on over 1,800 missing child cases. And for the data sources that were used to be able to do this project, first, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the Adam program were able to provide the information on historic missing children's cases. And then LexisNexis Risk Solutions was able to provide data on financial transactions, which more information about these types of financial transactions will be described in further slides. Now I will go ahead and discuss a general analysis that was performed on the data set of all missing child cases as was provided by NCMEC and the Adam program. So to begin with a high-level view of the data that we have on missing child cases. First, we have a total of over 26,000 total missing child cases that were reported to NCMEC. And as of July 21st, 2023, there are over 1,500 active cases. And for the purpose of this presentation, active cases means cases that have not been resolved. So cases in which the child is still currently missing or the child has not been found. And overall, 94% of cases have been resolved. And now to take a look at some demographic information about the ages of children that have gone missing. So when we first take a look at the age distribution of cases by decade, or the chart on the left, we see that the majority of missing child cases are those of children from ages 15 to 17. In addition to this, NCMEC released a statement that states that most missing child cases are of runaway children. So, given the fact that most cases are of children ages 15 to 17, and that most cases are of runaway children, then the intersection between these two populations must be large. So most of the cases of children ages 15 to 17 must be runaways. And these runaways are at an especially high risk for homelessness and nefarious activities such as gang involvement and trafficking. And to speak on trafficking itself, NCMEC released a statement that in 2022, 1 in 6 runaways were likely sex trafficking victims. So obviously, based on the statistics and this large prevalence of runaway cases, sex trafficking is a very real danger for missing children. And If we take a look at the table on the left or the table on the right, something that I'd like to call out is that if we look at the total number of missing cases by decade, specifically those cases in the decade of 2010 and those so far in the decade of 2020, we see that even though we are only 3.5 years into in the decade of 2020, we see that there are almost half as many missing child cases as there were in the entirety of the decade of 2010, which means that if we take this rate of missing child cases and we project it to predict the number of missing child cases by the end of this decade, we are looking at about 21,000 total missing child cases. And then to take a look at the demographics of missing children over time, we'll start first by looking at the distribution of race over time, once again by decade. And I'd first like to call out in the decade of 2000 to 2010, we see that at first the split of the races of missing children is roughly equal between those cases of white children and those of minority children. But as we progress over time, we start to see that the percentage of missing cases that are of minority children is actually increasing, and those of white children is decreasing. And some explanations for the rise in minority cases could be attributed to a couple factors. One of them could be specifically in the case of African American children, that there could be a rise in cases of that race demographic due to increased homelessness. And in addition, if we take a look at the cases for Hispanic children specifically, this chart may actually not be completely representative of all missing Hispanic children, because in the case of those children that are undocumented immigrants, the parents or other associated people of those missing children may not want to report the cases to NCMEC to be able to protect their identity. Another statistic that was released by NCMEC is that child sex trafficking cases reported to NCMEC include male, female, and transgender children. So, contrary to some beliefs, all gender of children are at risk for being trafficked. And as we can see on the chart on the right for the distribution of gender over time, we see that the missing children's cases are heavily skewed towards female cases. But as we progress over time, we start to see that slowly the distribution between female and male cases is changing, where the percentage of overall missing cases for male children is slowly starting to increase, and those of female children is starting to decrease. So by looking at the distribution of race and gender of missing child cases over time, we can see that as time is progressing, the demographics of these missing children are starting to change, and they're starting to skew more towards cases of minority children and slowly starting to increase those of male children. For the next part of this project, we wanted to incorporate additional data into that of the missing children's historical data set to be able to see if we could use HPCC and internal LexisNexis data to be able to potentially assist in finding missing children. And to do this, we incorporated financial transactions data from LexisNexis Risk Solution. So for this data, we took financial transactions data that matched the missing children's name, date of birth, and state of disappearance. And we focused on suspicious activity for those cases that were currently active. So basically looking at financial transactions that used the identity of the child after the child went missing. And for the purpose of this study, financial transactions are defined as any financial activity, including loans, cell phone financing, prepaid cards, opening up new bank accounts, etc. And the reason why we focused on active cases as opposed to overall cases is because when we're looking at financial transactions that had matches on the missing children's identities after they went missing, this is incredibly suspicious because if a child is missing, there should not be any financial transactions that are being used in their name. So this could potentially lend to either nefarious activity directly involving the child, or somebody could just be stealing the identity of the child to be able to make these financial transactions. And so by incorporating this data, we were actually able to discover that, in fact, there were missing children's identities that were being used in financial transactions. And one more piece of supplemental data that we were able to incorporate into the study to get some further insights. So in the LexisNexis database, we also have information on who has been previously associated with addresses that are being used on financial transactions. So we were able to take the addresses on these suspicious financial transactions and get a list of people that have been previously associated with these addresses. And in having that information, we were able to look further into these identities and see if there was any nefarious activity that was related to these identities, which we did have some interesting findings, which I will explain further on into this presentation. So HPCC was incredibly useful and actually made this project possible. In LexisNexis Risk Solutions database, we have a total of 117 billion records of financial transactions. And we need a system that would be powerful enough to be able to parse through these transactions and narrow down to the transactions that were of most interest to us. In this case, these suspicious transactions of active missing child cases. So to process these transactions, we first started off with the 117 billion records, and then we first narrowed those down to 21 billion records that did not have a Lex ID. And a Lex ID is an in-house identifier that we have that is associated to people who have previous established credit history. So in the case where an identity doesn't have a Lex ID, that means that that identity does not have established credit history. And this tends to be the population of those who are just applying for a credit card for the first time. They could be immigrants, or in many cases, minors do not have an established credit history. So we thought that if we look at the transactions of those that did not have this identifier, that this population would be the most likely population in which we would be able to find any transactions that may be using these missing children's identities. And then after narrowing down to these 21 billion transactions, we then further narrowed down to 21 million transactions. And specifically, those 21 million transactions are those that do not have a Lex ID and that occurred after 2018. And then after narrowing it down to the 21 million records, we then finally subset to those records that matched missing children's identities by, as mentioned before, by name, date of birth, and state. And now I will discuss the actual number of identities and number of suspicious transactions that actually matched the current active missing cases. So I wanted to start off though with a montage of actual active cases right now. As a data scientist, it's very easy to get absorbed in the numbers and to not be as connected to the actual identities and the pictures of these missing children. And so by including this montage, I would like to help humanize the findings of this study and remind everybody that these are real missing children's identities that are potentially being exploited. So of all current active cases that we have as of July 21st, 2023, 7% of those cases had matching inquiries. 7% of them had at least one inquiry. That's a large number, especially considering that there are over 1,500 active missing cases. And now to start off, in those, when we take that 50,000 total amount of matching transactions, we narrowed it down to 566 transactions that were of both missing children, that were of active cases only. So those 50,000 had included, that included matches of both active and resolved cases, and the 566 are of only active cases. So in those 566 total matching inquiries, 72 different missing children's identities were used in those inquiries. And even more alarming, when we narrow down to the active, the transactions of the active cases that occurred after the children went missing, we had a total of 278 total suspicious inquiries. And of those 278 suspicious inquiries, that included 41 different children's identities that were being exploited. That is over 50% of all transactions and all identities that had been associated with active cases. And some additional facts about these suspicious inquiries, we found that of all the identities, the identity that had the most total suspicious inquiries under their name was one identity that had 107 total suspicious inquiries that matched their information. And in addition to this, we found that for over 59% of these 41 identities, the 59% of those identities had at least 2 suspicious inquiries associated with them. So overall, we are seeing that there is, in fact, evidence that that over 40 different missing children are having their identities exploited in close to 300 total suspicious inquiries. And now we're going to do a similar analysis as we did in the beginning with the overall missing children's cases. And we're going to take a look at the age and demographic distribution of those identities that do have suspicious inquiries. So we'll start off by looking at the race of these children who maybe having their identities exploited. So when we take a look by race, so when we had looked at the overall cases, we had seen that only 16% of all missing children's cases were those of Hispanic children. But when we narrow down to those active cases, the identities of the active cases that have suspicious inquiries, we see that of the 41 identities, 56% of them were of Hispanic children. That's a considerably larger percentage of children, of those children's identities who have suspicious inquiries associated with them than of the overall distribution of missing children. And even more alarming is when we take a look at the suspicious inquiries overall, and we see that 90% of the suspicious inquiries were associated to identities of Hispanic children. So that means that on average, there are 11 suspicious transactions occurring per Hispanic child. And now taking a look at the distribution of these suspicious inquiries and these identities by gender, we see that of all of the identities that were associated with these suspicious inquiries, that 56% of the identities were associated to female children. And so that's a little bit more equally distributed in regards to identities than when we took a look at the demographics of missing children overall. But when we take a look at the transactions themselves, we see that 76% of all suspicious transactions were associated with identities of female children. So that averages to about 9 suspicious transactions per female child. And finally, when we take a look at these identities and suspicious transactions by age of children, we saw that when we looked at the distribution of missing cases overall, that roughly 73% of the overall cases were of children who went missing between ages of 15 and 17. And once again, we see that of those 41 identities of children associated with suspicious inquiries, that 73% of them are those of children that went missing between ages 15 and 17. And when we take a look at the overall total suspicious transactions, we see that 55% of them are attributed to the identities of those who went missing between ages 15 to 17. So that averages to about 5 transactions per child. Another 5% of those transactions were associated with children who were less than 15 years old. And then finally, the remaining 40% of those suspicious transactions were attributed to those children that went missing at 18 years old. So as we can see, by looking at the analysis of the demographics of children that are attributed to these suspicious inquiries, that we are seeing that minority children, female children, and those children who went missing between ages 15 and 17 are the most at risk for having their identities used in these financial transactions. And next, when we take a look at the distribution of missing transactions in regards to these missing children, we see that if we take a look at the first seen date for these suspicious inquiries, which basically just means the date per identity that a suspicious transaction appeared in our database under the name of these various children's identities. We initially thought that the reason for the large number of suspicious inquiries could be due to criminals going onto the NCMEC website and scraping all of these active missing children's cases, personal information, and then taking that information and then applying to doing applications or having other financial transactions using the information of the missing children. So we would have thought if that were the case, then there shouldn't really be a relationship between the date that the children went missing and the date that these transactions are first showing up in our database. But in fact, we think that we may be wrong in this assumption, because if we take a look at this chart, we see that actually the first scene date of most of these transactions are occurring within the first 6 months after a child has gone missing. So it seems that there may in fact be a relationship to when these transactions are first appearing and when a child first starts to go missing. Another interesting and alarming finding that we found by looking at these suspicious inquiries were the fact that some of these transactions actually utilized invalid home addresses. For instance, we found home addresses that were being attributed to retail centers, intersections, empty lots, road islands, and even forests. Obviously, people do not live at these different addresses. So it comes to be incredibly suspicious that that somebody is utilizing invalid home addresses in these financial transactions. And by finding these disturbing trends in these financial transactions, especially one as obvious and alarming as using invalid home addresses, this information could help raise red flags and could be a way to be useful to law enforcement, specifically when we find that a transaction is using an invalid home address, that potentially having that transaction actually being directly funneled to law enforcement and having them take further action into exploring what exactly this transaction is and perhaps who it is actually attributed to. And there has been some other disturbing trends in regards to these transactions, and they particularly involve other examples of invalid or mismatched personal information. So, for example, in regards to, once again, addresses, we see that some addresses that were, some home addresses that were attributed to these financial transactions were actually hundreds of miles from the original location of disappearance of that missing child. In addition, some of these transactions utilized multiple combinations of different pieces of personal information. In the fraud sector, we call this PII tumbling. And so, for example, this could appear as for one child that had multiple suspicious inquiries associated with their information, that one inquiry could utilize one phone number, the other one could utilize a different phone number. And this can be for any type of personal information, such as I mentioned, phone numbers. This could be their social security number or even their address. Next, something else that was suspicious was that we found that some, specifically for the financial transactions that were involving banks, that there were some applications to banks that exclusively served customers outside of the state of disappearance too. So So if a home address that was listed and associated with a financial transaction was of the state of disappearance of a child, why would somebody be potentially applying to financial services that serve customers outside of the state of disappearance? They wouldn't be eligible for those services. So that seems to be incredibly suspicious. Another finding that we had was in regards to this additional information that we have in our database regarding potential identities that are additionally linked to the home addresses that were associated with these financial transactions. Specifically, when we looked into some of these identities that were associated to those addresses, we found that some of them actually had criminal records. In one case, by doing a simple Google search, we found that one identity that had stolen or one transaction that had stolen and used the information of an active missing case was actually a child predator and was obviously listed publicly as that. And of course, in the case where we found that these linked identities to those home addresses did have a criminal history, that could be due to that associated identity actually had something to do with the disappearance of the child, or that person did not actually have any association with the child or any involvement in the disappearance of the child, but they may have just been opportunistic in knowing that the child had gone missing and instead just took that information, stole that identity, and had various financial transactions using their information. And then finally, another suspicious trend that we found among these inquiries were that some phone numbers that were associated with the financial transactions had area codes that were either unassigned, were associated with directory assistance, or were international area codes. So for example, we found some suspicious financial transactions that utilized 1-800 or 1555 numbers, which cannot be attributed to one single individual. And so overall, I'd like to sum up the findings that we had when incorporating this additional financial transactions information. So we can come to the conclusion that LexisNexis Risk Solutions has the resources to help connect fraudulent financial activity with missing children. So we saw that missing child cases where financial activity linked the identities of missing children could help link. We also had the information to potentially link them with other perpetrators. And in our case, it was specifically by incorporating that additional address linkage data. In addition to this, we found that some applications that utilized missing children's stolen identities showed similarities with third-party fraud profiles. And basically, third-party fraud means that criminals are utilizing others, not their own identities, to make these various financial transactions. And in this case, we saw that some of the matching characteristics that these suspicious transactions involving missing children to those of third-party fraud included this PII tumbling or using all of these different combinations of personal information when only using, for instance, in our case, one name, one date of birth, and one state. And then finally, we saw that the demographics can differ between those children that have their identity stolen versus when we look at the overall distribution of missing child cases. And specifically in the case of suspicious inquiries, we saw that females, Hispanic children, and those children that went missing between ages 15 and 17 were most at risk for having their identity stolen. And of course, with this study, this is just one example of many directions that can be taken by utilizing supplemental data. In the next slides, we will discuss some other directions that we have for future studies and additional data that we could incorporate to get further insights on these various active missing child cases. But first, to discuss some changes that are currently being implemented thanks to the results of the study, we found that we are actively trying to determine ways to proactively protect missing children's identities. And this includes future discussions with customers to prevent identity theft of missing children's identities. So for instance, using these insights and these suspicious trends that were associated with these suspicious inquiries and letting our clients know about these different types of trends so that they can be on heightened lookout for any appearance of these trends in regards to the financial transactions. And in addition to this, we would also like to have a future discussion with NCMEC about the findings of this project. And actually, one development is that as of August 23rd, 2023, NCMEC has actually changed their posters as an added precaution to eliminate personal details and actually focus instead on a child's image and current age so that the public can better recognize who they are looking for. So now if you go on the NCMEC website and look at their missing child posters, you can no longer see their personal information such as their date of birth and some additional demographic information. And then finally, for some future project ideas that we would like to examine some additional attributes that our company has created. So for example, additional information regarding like fraud associated with the home address that was used in the application, etc., to help get a richer view of personal information history and associated identities. In addition, we'd like to incorporate additional data such as criminal records, relatives and associates, and school data. And we'd like to use that information to help create a dashboard that could produce reports that could be sent over to law enforcement on various missing child cases and any potentially associated perpetrators. And then finally, we would also like to collaborate with other organizations and nonprofits. And all of these steps we would not be able to do without the help of HPCC systems. And then for a quick call to action for how you can help. So one fantastic example of how you can help is that the CEO of LexisNexis Risk Solutions government sector did a cross-state bike ride from August 23rd to 25th. He biked 320 miles from Maine to Massachusetts to help fundraise for NCMEC programs, and he aims to raise $1 million. He aimed to raise $1 million in doing so. In addition, NCMEC provides resources for what to do if your child has gone missing. And additionally, here's some contact information for both NCMEC and the ADAM program. And we highly recommend that you use the link for the ADAM program to sign up to receive alerts for missing child cases in your area. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to share them now.